For him, he says, look at the non and non-philosophy like the non and non-Euclidean geometry. So between geometry and non-Euclidean geometry is a mutation of regular geometry that it looks at space in a different way. And I think that's specifically how he wants people to look at his difference from philosophy. It's not that he says we get rid of philosophy. On the contrary, it needs a mutation so we can liberate it from itself. And so in 1989, he writes, 4 years after Biography of an Ordinary Man, Philosophy and Non-Philosophy, which Univocal will be publishing next spring. And I'll give you just an excerpt here because I think it gets exactly to what he's trying to do. And I think for the artist here, I think it might be of interest later when we talk at the next lecture about his concept of non-photography. And so the excerpt I'm just going to read, just simply a blurb about the book, is each generation invents new practices and new writings of philosophy. Ours should have been able to introduce certain mutations that would at least be equivalent with those of Cubism, abstract art, and 12-tone surrealism. It has only partially done so, the postmodernist theorist. But after deconstructions, after all the deconstructions, after Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Derrida, this demand takes on a different dimension. What do we do with philosophy itself? How do we globally change our relation to this thought, which keeps indicating that it is increasingly conservative and repetitive? These two questions together have prompted what we call non-philosophy. Non-philosophy is not the negation of philosophy, it is the suspension of philosophy's claim to think the real, what I got at earlier, which is the principle of sufficient philosophy, that it assumes it can reflect on everything in the world and do it in a concrete way. And it is in the invention of new uses of thought and language that disrupt the rational narrative of the real, which is precisely what every philosophy is. Non-philosophy should rather be understood as a non-Euclidean geometry, namely as a generalization of the philosophical beyond its traditional limitation. From then on, an infinite number of philosophical decisions that are no longer mutually exclusive will correspond with any real phenomenon whatsoever. Now, this is really difficult work. I've worked on it for over a year now. And so slowly, I think as I get further on here, we'll be able to see what he's really trying to get at. Because he's not trying to go away from philosophy. He's trying to liberate new ways to use it by others, not just philosophers. And it reminds me actually of something that Gilles Deleuze said in an interview, which he said that what philosophy didn't do, unlike a lot of other art forms, whether it was music or abstract art, that philosophy needed to mutate as well. And so there's a very interesting relation between he and Deleuze, which I'll get at some point later. But Deleuze said what we need are maxed Ernsts of philosophy. And so I like that claim, and I haven't told Laruelle this yet, but I think perhaps maybe he is the sort of character like that. So going on to quickly through a trajectory, the book, The Concept of Non-Photography, which is over there for purchase if you'd like to get a copy. He wrote this in 1992, okay? And it came out last year. So a lot of his major texts still haven't been translated in English. A book we're going to be publishing in another month on photo fiction and non-standard aesthetics, which he'll be here lecturing about, is his continuation of what he calls a non-aesthetics, trying to figure out new ways to think aesthetics where art isn't inferior to philosophy or has to let philosophy have the upper hand when thinking about art, which is typically the case. And it's very interesting, and I won't go into it now. So continuing his trajectory, later we have works such as the Dictionary of Non-Philosophy, where he tries to really collect his terms and a new vocabulary to think his sort of world, which is sort of kind of uncanny. Most thinkers don't do that sort of thing. But anyway, so what is this science he's trying to get at? What is it called? Non-philosophy is science for philosophy and of philosophy. And so a question, again, getting back to his sort of constant reminder that he wants us to situate it as like Euclidean geometry, is that perhaps he's trying to think of a new way to think space with philosophy. And so As I was reading this book not too long ago by Jules Châtelet called Science and Philosophy, Figuring Space, Philosophy and Mathematics and Physics, it's about diagrams. And it's very interesting, and I found a couple paragraphs that I think are worth mentioning, and then I think we'll get into perhaps a little bit more into how you can look at what he's doing. So I'm going to read those, and then hopefully we can get to it in a little bit. So, in the introduction by Kenneth Knepsel, he says, what Châtelet is emphasizing in the importance of looking at manual technologies to think space and to formulate space, looking at rulers, straight edges, compasses and protractors, coordinate systems. Each have been taken for granted, these sort of manual technologies, that we fail to see why they have controlled our spatial interactions. So these sort of technological advancements, perhaps, are ways of controlling our spatial interactions. And it made me think, for example, how do apps or phones control our spatial interactions? It is in this sort of a mobility that we get that it also obliterates our old ways of looking at space. And I wonder, perhaps, if we can look at philosophy and its relation to non-philosophy in that way. So that's something to think about. But for Châtelet, in his words, space appears as a visible understanding and an understanding of invisible space. It's essential to the pedagogy of the reader of his work, looking at doodles and diagrams, to look at it as an overview. And I think an overview is all you're ever get from Laruelle. It's always in the last instance. It's a performance in the last instance. And so I'll get at a quote by another Laruelle scholar in a second to back up this sort of claim. But I think there's an uncanny sort of sentence worth mentioning here. He says, Châtelet here, in the introduction, what is it that overviews do for Châtelet using diagrams, for example, to try to sketch out space quickly? Again, being insufficient. And for Châtelet, he says it transports us to a privileged zone where intuition and discursivity become knotted into a living unity. It is neither a priori nor posteriori. It is a contemporaneous with what it grasps. The look that seizes in one go any development that leads to new truth, but comprising instances that have not yet become exposed. It is for this reason that the presentiment can at the beginning only be obscure. This is why scientific presentation is essentially progression of two series of developments, one which leads in the consequence from one truth to the next and forms the content in the proper, while the other controls the process itself and determines the form. So this look that seizes or grasps in one go any development that leads to truth, but comprising instances that have not yet become exposed, I think this is partly what Laruelle's trying to do when he's trying to think of the vision in one, or immanence in an immanent way, in the last instance. And I'll go on, and he'll say that the way he tries to do non-philosophy is that it's every philosophy possible in the last instance. It's every non-theology in the last instance. And so he's trying to somehow carve a way to think immanence in an immanent way that somehow would encompass a way of looking, a sort of scientific way of looking at the world, where all these other sort of philosophical disciplines would fit into the equation. And it's a little bizarre, and hopefully I can clear it up. By comparing what I just said with a Laruelle scholar named John Malarkey in his recent description of Laruelle's science of non-philosophy. And from Malarkey, he says, philosophy needs to lose its vocation in representationalization, in the sense of its own sufficiency, which I got at earlier. If philosophy as a whole were the chosen subject, then non-philosophy mimes philosophy in one, in the last instance. That is, in one gesture, and as part of the real one. Philosophy is not broken down into its component parts. Again, it's this sort of grasping of it in the last instance, the whole of it. So it's not about Aristotelian wonder, Cartesian doubt, Hegelian dialectics, Heideggerian questioning, etc. This would only work for those who already believe that all philosophy is in essence, when good, when true, Heideggerian or Hegelian or some such thing. So for Malarkey, Laruelle minds philosophy as a whole, always in the last instance. And this is something that's a little bit hard for me to grasp at, but the more you look at what he's trying to do as a non-philosophy, trying to open it up for new ways of thinking, I think it will become clearer. What he does, in my mind, is he's trying to get people away from saying, well, are you Heideggerian? Are you Derridian? Do you think are you Hegelian? And for him, if you look at a mutation of it, those sort of questions don't matter anymore. What matters is new ways of thinking. And so for Laruelle too, at the end of the day, what is important for him is invention and creativity. And so when I've asked him, and I'm going to read a couple of answers he gave to me, when I asked him essentially, is non-philosophy about liberating the subject? What is the ultimate goal here? And he said, in the end, it's about inventing. But inventing what? Inventing your life, inventing some sort of new object, creating something. But it's trying to figure out new ways to think and invent. And this is precisely what science is always striving to do. And for Laruelle, philosophy is always looking back. It's always looking back to its past. It always has to base things off Hegel or Kant or Plato. And for Laruelle, he thinks that there needs to be a new way to use philosophy as a material to liberate it from these sort of ways of looking backwards instead of looking forward into what you would say immanence or the real in the last instance. So, again, I hope I haven't lost you all completely by now. And if I have, perhaps that's better, because again, Laruelle will also say there are many non-philosophers as there are non-philosophies. So what am I doing here? Am I doing a non-workshop? Am I doing a non-philosophy? Am I a non-philosopher?